Thanks very much, Fraser. I've got some notes here because there's a whole lot of issues that I want to cover, but I need my reading glasses to read my own notes. So, Hui E, just very briefly, Hui E is a national network right across the community and voluntary sector. So there's organisations from all parts, really, of the community and voluntary sector and across the country. Several thousand organisations on our mail list. You're welcome to get in touch and join if you like. But there's no fee, although you're welcome to make a donation. So look, we try to deal with whole of sector issues, like, for example, charities legislation, tax legislation, incorporated societies legislation is particularly the area I work in, and building connections and strengthening the whole community and voluntary sector, recognising that we have a lot of issues in common across the sector. So for me today, this has been really, really exciting. You know, seeing the learnings, the connections that are being made, you know, at the table I was at, you know, people connecting up, taking each other's contact details and saying, look, we can really productively work together in future. And I think that's really fantastic, really inspiring from my perspective. What I've also seen, of course, is that, you know, I was at a table about local and central government, but a lot of the discussions were about housing and interconnection between housing and demographics for Maori particularly, and also for people with disability and people with mental health issues. They all, you know, and you can't deal with the housing issues unless you deal with the other issues that are also causing somebody to be in a situation where their housing is unstable. So it's great that this kind of networking can happen, and really congratulations to the organisers from my perspective too. So the collaboration, the sharing of resources, you know, the community house that you got is really fantastic. That's a real asset to the city. I see cities where there's not such a fantastic basis for connection across the sector and for recognising the common issues. And this is a real boon. One comment I've made just about the particular session I was in, a comment was made that maybe there's too many organisations. And I hear that quite a lot, and particularly when people hear there's 27,000 charities. A couple of comments really. One is that a network like you have here, that Fraser was talking about, I mean, that's fantastic because it reduces the chances of people getting excited or getting concerned about a particular issue and then setting up a new organisation when there is another one just around the corner already doing it. You can go to a centre and can find out what's already happening, and that can save a lot of trouble. But also, this thing about there being too many organisations, one thing that, I mean, 2 words really, 3, the Christchurch experience. You know, after the earthquake, it was the community networks that helped people, that went door to door in communities, made sure that people were okay, helped people who needed help, and then started setting up systems. Look, our toilet's working, our shower's working, we've got an outside tap in our water, we've got our own water supply, you know, we'll share that. And it took a day for the army to get there, and it took 2 days for civil defence to get there, and I mean in general terms more or less, and they came in and said, okay, you know, relax, we're here now, we can do it. But the community organisations, you know, were the ones who were already doing it, and, you know, government came in and, you know, they're not very good at recognising what communities are already doing sometimes. So I would argue against that approach of there being too many community organisations. Getting on to some of the work that we're doing at the national level, looking at the problem areas over in the corner there that were raised in the first session. Big one is around individual client data and Oranga Tamariki and MSD and SIFs and so on, that whole thing, and of course health moving in that same direction and other government agencies. Doing what I do. This week I've been in meetings with 2 cabinet ministers, and both of them have said, you know, don't publicly say that I said this, or don't attach my name to it. Don't attach my name to it, whatever you do. But they've said, look, government's been doing a rethink. They've realised the pushback from the Privacy Commissioner and from community and sector organisations, from news media, from just about Uncle Tom Cobley and all. They're doing a bit of a rethink. Everyone agrees that data is useful. You know, we've got to, you know, to identify, firstly, where needs are, where services need more support, where there's more people coming in that the services can cope with, and also, you know, realistically, recognise where the services that are redundant. You know, I know of organisations that have closed down simply because there's no longer need for their services, because people are accessing something completely different. And sometimes we've got to be brave and take that tough decision. But anyway, they're going to be doing some announcements in the next week or two about a slightly different approach. So I look forward to that. Yeah, that's enough said about MSD. We're working with charity services, and the big issue there has been advocacy. They've been a bit hung up about it the last few years, probably more than their legislation actually calls for. And they've been discouraging people from putting anything about advocacy in their constitutions when they're rewriting or updating their constitution, or for any new organisations. Advocacy has been regarded as a no-no. Well, they've lost several cases in the High Court around Greenpeace was one. I see there's a couple of people from National Council of Women here. Congratulations to National Council of Women, because they stuck with it all the way. Yeah, and won against charity services, and then because their charitable status was taken away, and then IRD said, well, you were not, and with the same constitution, their charitable status was eventually reinstated by the direction of the court, but then IRD wanted tax for all the money that had gone through National Council of Women for the period that they were not a registered charity. And National Council of Women stuck with it, and they beat IRD as well. So huge ups to National Council of Women on that, and charities. And charity services now are come back to what their legislation actually says, which is, and you can do advocacy just so long as it's not your main purpose. So if you're involved, for example, in housing, you're the one who knows about the needs of the people that you're serving. Who's going to tell government about what those needs are? You're the one in the best position. That's not advocacy. That's telling government what's the best thing to do. I mean, you might push it a little, but you know, you know. So anyway, that's charity services. MB, you know, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, they cover a lot of different stuff. There's 3-4 particular areas we're working with them at the moment, and they're so big, you know, I introduce people from MB to people from MB sometimes and say you should be working with this person. But the procurement guidelines that they've just come out with some guidelines for procurement by government departments in terms of the contracting, you know, the purchasing of services that government agencies are moving towards. There's guidelines for that. Unfortunately, they're good guidelines. They're better than the first draft that was out a couple of years ago that I commented on. But unfortunately, they are only guidelines. So, for example, you have MSD doing its own thing and having much more stringent requirements. But one thing that's very good in the guidelines that MB have come out with is that they openly acknowledge that community organisations, charities, incorporated societies, even if they have a contract with a funder, that contract must not impinge on the independence of the organisation to do advocacy on behalf of the people that they're serving. So if anybody tries to give you a contract which says you can't advocate about the service, you can't go to the media or some other language like that, well, point them towards MB's guidelines for procurement and the paragraph about advocacy there. So that's a bit of a win for us. It's just a bit of, not quite such a win as I would have liked, because it's optional for the other government agencies. Yeah, charity services, well, they brought in the accounting standards through MB. Everybody's grappling with those. I understand this year, the past year, something like 46% of organisations met the standard in terms of the reporting they did. We've been encouraging charity services to actually do more help to people to meet the standards, you know. And part of the problem, of course, has been that the accountants themselves have never read the standards. So there have been cases of charities submitting their accounts to charity services. They don't meet the standard, but they were written by a fully qualified accountant that the organisation had to pay for. So charities services is now going back to the accounting profession and say, hey, not on to charge people for something that doesn't even meet the requirements. If you're in that situation, tell your accountant they have to fix it for free. Incorporated societies, we did a roadshow around the country last year, with a draft new piece of legislation for incorporated societies. The proposal then was that the legislation would go through this year and be in, you know, have a start date in 2018, and by 2021 you have to fully comply. Well, that's all been set back a year because it's firstly a change of minister, and then MB didn't have the staff to finish the draft legislation, and now it's election year, so it's not going to go through this year. So your final compliance date's going to be about 2022. But if you're thinking of changing your constitution, do think about what might be in that required legislation. Particularly what's going to be required is dispute resolution clauses, provisions in your constitution. Working with IRD, fringe benefit tax, they just earlier this week came out with a final decision on some provisions. They floated a draft at the beginning of the year. I don't know how much detail people want, but I see somebody shaking their head back there. But yeah, briefly, if you're a registered charity and you're running a business or a social enterprise and you're employing staff but paying extras for those staff, like for example supplying a car out of the social enterprise, out of the business, you're now going to be responsible for fringe benefit tax reporting, and you'll have to pay fringe benefit tax in relation to that car. So any non-salary kind of non-cash payments support to your staff that are coming out of your social enterprise, there's fringe benefit tax now. The irony is, of course, that if you just take the money out of the business, out of the social enterprise, put it into the charity and then pay your staff, you won't be eligible for fringe benefit tax. It's that easy. State Services Commission, there's a global movement called Open Government Partnership, which New Zealand signed up to about 3 years ago, and it's had a very poor series of reports about its level of partnership with civil society, which is, you know, the community and voluntary sector, in terms of developing its plans. Well, we all know that, that it's been a pretty poor performance the last few years, but State Services Commission is responsible for changing that, and they're promising now that they will do some work on it. And internationally, We're doing a lot of work with a global group called Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation, and they firstly doing a lot of work standing up for the rights of communities to organise in the ways that they want without government interference. But also they're a channel that made input to a framework, and this is where, as I mentioned to Fraser earlier, there's so many specific issues that we experience in communities. You know, everything from water quality to equal pay for women, to education which is accessible to everybody, and I mean everybody, including disabled children and children whose primary language is not English, and for prisoners, for example, access to education. All of these issues, conservation, quality of oceans, fisheries, they're all built into this global framework, which was signed in Paris in September 2015. And New Zealand was there and is one of the signatories to this global framework, sometimes called Global Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the New Zealand government, since it signed up, has basically said, well, we've got our own framework, we've got our own set of goals. They are called the Better Public Service Goals. And yeah, I see a few people laughing. They're very narrow and they're very set by governments, they're shaped by government's ideology. Whereas the Sustainable Development Goals are shaped by global consultation involving most of the countries in the world and a lot of these global groups like Civicus, like Amnesty International, like the World Conservation Organisations, huge range of organisations made input alongside the states, you know, the states, countries, the members of the United Nations, as equal partners. And that's the really fantastic thing about these Sustainable Development Goals, as partners. And a key part of the way these Sustainable Development Goals are to be implemented is by governments in partnership with civil society, in partnership with communities and citizens. So government has to, sooner or later, address this. You know, there's going to be a reporting mechanism. Now, some countries have already, for example, governments have done progress reports at the United Nations about what they're doing. In some countries, community organisations have gotten together through a national network and have provided their own report, even though their government has done nothing. So that's been embarrassing for governments. We're thinking maybe we should go down that track too, because our government also has said, oh no, we're you know, our indices are much better than most countries and we've got our own plans, so we're not going to do anything. Well, we're going to have to report on what we've done. At the moment, government hasn't even decided which is going to be the lead agency for the coordination. They've left it with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are great at reporting to the United Nations, but in terms of understanding what's happening in communities across the country and how we can develop that and how we can improve that, what does MFAT know? You know, Foreign Affairs and Trade, that's their deal. Nothing about communities, nothing about quality of our water or of our education. So we're pushing through Civicus and also in Wellington with the different government agencies. You know, it's been handed, it's like pass the parcel at the moment in Wellington with these Sustainable Development Goals. But we've been pushing government to take some responsibility. We're working with all the political parties on that because you probably sense here in Palmerston North, we certainly sense in Wellington, government has no overall framework for addressing the interrelationships between the specific problems that we face. You know, nobody is seeing the connection, in central government at least, the connection between mental health and housing, between mental health and imprisonment, between disability, particularly hearing loss, and imprisonment. You know, the proportion of prisoners who have significant hearing loss and therefore were disadvantaged in education because their hearing loss wasn't properly addressed. Or, you know, I know of situations where people with a hearing loss were classified as intellectually disabled, you know. And their issues were never addressed, so they never got a decent education, so they, you know, end up police, prison. No, you know, if somebody had addressed the hearing loss. So we need a plan, we need a framework, and that's what the Sustainable Development Goals are offering. So government's going to have to do something. We're encouraging them every opportunity that we can. So there's a bit of flavour of what's happening in Wellington, but also the global kind of framework that we're working in. I just touch again on Civicus. I've got a minute. Yeah. So that World Alliance for Citizen Participation that we're working in, what's also coming through there is that, and we've got the Secretary General from Civicus is speaking at a parliamentary breakfast that I've organised next week about the evolution of democracy, so that citizen participation can be strengthened and that governments are less able to make unilateral decisions without actually the participation of local government and communities and individual citizens. And the technology is coming. I was talking to somebody earlier who was involved with technology with the council. It's coming, and it's getting easier and easier to use. So the opportunities for participation are opening out there. In the meantime, we've got these issues to deal with, but here in Palmerston North, I'm inspired by the connections that you have, the ways you have of working together, the support you've got from the council for doing that. So thank you very much. This has been fantastic. Cheers.